Let's get joined up. Today's show is brought to you by Audible, and right now you can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/joinedup. There's over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, Kindle, or MP3 player. So thanks for tuning in to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, a regular show about all things writing, including interviews with authors, screenwriters, and key figures from the publishing industry. Plus loads of hints, tips, and inspiration for all creatives. You can follow us on Twitter at JU Podcast, leave a quick iTunes review, or just tell a friend. Right, cue that new theme tune. Hello and welcome to the Joined Up Writing Podcast, where a little procrastination can go a long way. I'm Wayne Kelly and it's episode 125 with American novelist Jessica Anthony talking about her fast-paced, biting satire book, Enter the Aardvark. Jessica has had a fascinating life and career and gives real insight into her approach and writing process. At the top of the show, you may have noticed the alternative new theme music there. This one is the more funk-infused version, but still created by my longtime musical collaborator George Odom of Go Guitar Lessons. So which one do you prefer, the funky one or the more rock-flavoured tune we've had on the last couple of episodes? Drop me a line at wayne@waynekellywrites.co.uk or tweet us at JUPodcast and let me know which you prefer. Speaking of my friend George and our musical collaborations, I've picked up the guitar for the first time in what seems like years, and we've started what we hope will be weekly uploads called Lockdown Live, where we perform some of our songs and I edit together the various video clips of us both playing and singing the different parts. So last week we did our song Needle on the Black, all about our love of playing old records and the power of music. You can find it on Twitter, YouTube, and on the Joined Up Facebook page, and I'll put a link in today's show notes if you're interested in taking a look, that is. But what about you? I want to hear what you've been up to during this weird time, so whether it's writing related or not, so that I can share it on the show and across our social media. It's important that we keep supporting each other through this difficult time, and the writing community needs to push on, carry on being creative and positive and everything else, so let me know what you're up to. You can get in touch by tweeting me at JU Podcast, emailing wayne@waynekellywrites.com, or dropping me a line on the FB page, as I'd love to hear from you. Also, don't forget to join the email mailing list at joinedupwriting.co.uk to get free stuff and be the first to find out about upcoming shows and events. Right, let's get to today's interview with Jessica Anthony. So as you'll hear, Jessica has been a butcher in Alaska, an unlicensed masseuse in Poland, and a secretary in San Francisco. Her first book was The Convalescent, and she's also collaborated on graphic novel Chopsticks. In 2017, while writing her new book Enter the Aardvark, Jessica worked as a bridge guard, guarding the Maria Valeria Bridge in a remote part of Slovakia. But normally she lives in Maine and teaches at Bates College. So Enter the Aardvark is out right now, everywhere you can find good books. So here's the chat we recorded just a couple of weeks ago. Joined Up Writing. Jessica, thanks so much for joining me on Joined Up Writing. So why don't you start off just by telling us whereabouts you are in the world and what's going on with you, aside from a global pandemic, obviously, which is affecting everybody. What's going on with you?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Wayne. It's hard to say what's going on outside of the global pandemic. It's sort of taking over all of our lives. But I live in Portland, Maine. And so far, I've been lucky enough to avoid, major catastrophe. We're all, as they say, hunkered down here in the United States.
Yeah.
I'm working on a few articles for promotion of the novel, and I'm teaching online. I teach at Bates College. And these are some quiet days, but strangely at the same time, not quiet days. It's unusual. It's a very unusual time.
It is, yeah. And speaking to a lot of writers and a lot of creatives in general, I mean, on the face of it, you'd think this would suit a lot of writers from the point of view of the isolation, and a lot of us are introverts, and we like time to ourselves and all that kind of stuff. But most people are understandably finding it difficult to concentrate on doing any actual work and kind of focus on creativity. Have you found that yourself?
Well, the greatest diversion for me is actually just managing putting on a virtual book tour, which is what I'm doing right now. I've set up my studio like a little. It's like a mini TV station in my writing studio right now. I have
Yeah.
lights everywhere and various technologies to try and broadcast, recordings and Instagram live interviews. And so it's not at all the book tour and the experience that I would have imagined having. But here we are. And frankly, I'm very grateful for the technology at this point. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to speak about the book in some way. So the bottom line is I'm getting very little writing done because
Anyway, yeah.
I'm living in a TV studio. But, I imagine in a couple of weeks, once, I move past, well, I suppose in Britain, the book is coming out in a couple of weeks. So I'll be doing work for Britain. But, by May, perhaps mid-May, I'm hoping, to have a little bit of quiet time to be able to dive into the next book. But yeah, that's where I am right now.
Focus your creative energies in there. Well, why don't we start off for you telling us about your new book, Enter the Aardvark?
Enter the Aardvark, really simply put, is about a millennial Republican congressman in D.C. who one hot August morning receives on his front doorstep a gigantic taxidermied aardvark that ends up bringing down his entire reelection campaign.
Brilliant. I mean, what more do you need to say? It's such a novel idea. It's such an unusual idea. So what was the kind of jumping off point for you with that?
Well, I will often write from titles, Wayne. And so I read a lot of work from Andre Breton, a French surrealist poet.
Mm-hmm.
His Manifesto of Surrealism and there's a small treatise that he wrote in 1937 called Mad Love, where he writes about the waking sentence and how just a few gathering of words can enlighten or instigate, ignite some measure of interest in story. And sure. I've really, I've been writing this way for a while now, for over 15 years. I'll sort of have just a little scrap of poetry that will sit with me and stick with me for some reason. And then when the time comes, I write about it. So, which is all to say that it was back in 2012 when this phrase, Enter the Aardvark, appeared in my mind. And I sat with it for about 3 years. And then in 2015, in the run up to the 2016 US election, I realized that I wanted to be writing a political novel of some kind. I knew that it would be fast. I knew that it would be funny. And I wanted it to, in some ways, mirror my own sensation of what it was to be an American in 2015, witnessing this sort of aggrandized, hyperbolized political process that we were all participating in. And this is obviously something that I'm sure people in Britain are or can speak to, which is to say, like all of the conversation with Brexit and everything that's happened over there. And so, I began to think about this title, Enter the Aardvark, and I wondered if this was actually the title for a political story, and a political but also a human story, obviously. And so I walked into the title and I had this other kind of, this tumbling around of language that I'd been thinking about at the time. A whirling mass of vapors is unhinged. And so I sort of threw together those two sounds and began to write. I write from sound, I write from voice. Mm-hmm. And that's how the novel began.
And off you went. And as you say, it kind of captures it just even in the setup of it, because there is an air of the surreal about the political landscape and what's been going on for quite some time. And obviously, as you say, with Trump and everything else. So I guess it kind of all feeds into that.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's frankly one of the challenges I found as I was working on the novel. When I started in 2015, I wrote the first draft very quickly. It was about 6 weeks. And, we were all under the impression that Hillary Clinton was going to win the presidency. And so, Donald Trump was still this kind of remote, laughable, farcical notion. And then when that notion won through the electoral college process, suddenly what was being lampooned became realized. I don't know if you've ever seen the SNL sketch, Saturday Night Live sketch with Tina Fey mocking Sarah Palin. Did you ever see that?
I did see that. Yeah, it's very funny. Yeah.
Yeah, but what's funny about it is that it's actually quite grave, Wayne. Right? I mean, we have a comedian who is actually reading, the lines that were spoken, the ridiculous verbal salad that was spoken by Sarah Palin, and in that way, the performance became, quite literally the truth.
Yeah.
And so I think as a satirist, this novel, this work that I was writing as a sort of hyperbolized commentary, or just sort of a whimsy, frankly, it completely changed its tone as we moved through into 2017, 2018. I started to realize that I was actually writing something that a story that was satiric, but also was quite frightening in the way that it began to tell the truth about us, right?
Yeah.
Almost as though the mirror, a great satire will sort of hold a mirror up upon, a society, a culture, whatever it is trying to lampoon, and you see the distortion in that mirror, and so you start to feel the power of the truth of the sinister environment that you're living in. But somehow that mirror, the distortion went away. It just, it wasn't hyperbolized. It wasn't exaggerated. It was just what was there. And so strangely, it became, kind of a chilling novel for me in that way, even though it's a comedy and it's a romp. It also, in my view, is maybe telling us something about ourselves that, gosh, I really hope isn't true, but I think is true.
Sure, yeah. I think it's a big problem for satirists and comedians that deal with what's going on in the world at the minute. It's very difficult, as you say. Often one of the main tools that you've got in your box as a satirist or as a comedian or a cartoonist or whatever it is exaggeration and hyperbole, as you say.
Sure.
But it's very difficult to exaggerate some of these things because, a lot of the times the exaggeration, it's not exaggerated enough now with some of the things that have happened and some of the things that are said. It's like, how do you make that, how do you make a joke of that? It's actually, the truth was actually much exaggerated in the first place. So I completely understand that. So tell us a little bit about I understand that a lot of the work that you did on this novel, you did it in quite an unusual place, and you were in your role as bridge guard artist on the Maria Valeria Bridge. So tell us a little bit about that.
Oh, yes. So I applied for a position to guard a bridge in Slovakia.
Which, happens all the time.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it was a sort of a strange thing to do, I guess, in hindsight, where all my friends are, raising children. I went to guard a bridge in remote Slovakia. The bridge is the Maria Valeria Bridge. It is a 500-meter, tiered steel arch bridge that runs between Sturovo, Slovakia, and Esztergom, Hungary, crossing the Danube River. I'll tell you just the brief story of the bridge. Yeah, the bridge was built in the late 1800s, and then it was damaged in World War I and then rebuilt. And then the Nazis really obliterated it in World War II. And so the bridge was left that way, unrepaired for over 60 years. And the communities in Esztergom and Sturovo, well, they had family on the other side of the river. I mean, they were very closely knit. And suddenly they found this great divide, between the two countries. And funnily, in Sturovo, a huge number of the people who live in Sturovo are actually Hungarian. And so finally, in 2001, they decided they rebuilt the bridge. In October of 2001, it was completed. And they decided to set up a foundation where they would bring one artist every, 3 to 6 months to guard the bridge with their art, which is to say the mental act of guarding the bridge was more important than the physical guarding. So my job was to work on my novel, cross the bridge once a day. And doing this from their perspective was the means by which they would guard the bridge against further acts of violence. So it's novel writing to prevent fascism. That's what the bridge guarding was all about. And frankly, it was a perfect experience, to be honest, for this novel, because as you know, the novel travels between two time periods. And so there's a lot of, metaphorical bridge work going on between the story of Titus Downing, who stuffs the Aardvark, and the story of Alex Wilson, this rather corrupted, vain, millennial GOP asshole. Can I say asshole on your show?
Yeah, you just have, and that's absolutely fine.
All right,
that's quite tame. That's fine.
All right.
And sometimes it's the only word that will suffice, so that's fine.
Sometimes it's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So you, as you say, it's only like it's almost like you had this. You took on this kind of important role. Did that kind of make it not easier, but did it give you more of a sense of kind of purpose, and did it drive you on to crack on with the novel and to finish it, knowing that you were kind of doing it at the same time as that, and you kind of had this position that you were holding at the time?
Absolutely. And, it was coupled, it was that idea and that sort of, charge of purpose. I like that you said that. That was great. But it was also just the long, slow days that you need as a novelist, especially as you're finishing a novel. You have to really immerse yourself, at least I do as a writer. I have to just drop myself into the fiction and really have minimal distractions. And I can promise you that there aren't many more places on earth that are more boring than rural Slovakia. I mean, not much is going on. I mean, there was a beautiful little town, a lovely little spa town, and everyone was eating ice cream and everything, and that was great. But yeah, I mean, I speak some Czech, some Slovak, but not a lot, and so I was really forced to speak primarily with the novel, which was my main goal for going, for sure.
Absolutely, and what a great memory you're going to have of writing that novel as well.
Yeah, it was great. A lot of ants. I was battling ants a lot of cans of Raid.
That's the downside of it. So presumably, I mean, how are you going to top that for the next book that you write? What jobs are you applying for to put yourself in place for the next novel?
Well,
Space Station or.
Yeah, I know exactly. How can I top it? It's great. I don't know if this is going to have anything to do with my next novel, but I have a sense for the next book, and I've been accepted to a residency actually in Mount Vernon, which is where George Washington, our first president, obviously grew up, and it's where he lived with Martha for many, many years. And so there's sort of a building there for George Washington researchers, and most of them are scholars, frankly. They don't usually take us, us creatives. But they've allowed me to come, and I'm thrilled, which means I get to spend a month living in Mount Vernon and researching George Washington. I'm going to go and research the 3 days that occurred over his passing. So the death of George Washington is what I'm interested in. But I don't really know where it's going to go. I don't know what's going to come of it. So I'll have to just wait and see.
Well, it sounds like, just from the short amount of time that I've spoken to you, so it sounds like discovery is a big part of your writing, both in terms of your own experience and the way that you write the novel, and that kind of comes out in the little bits and pieces that I know about your CV. So tell us a little bit about some of the other interesting jobs and experiences that you've had over your time, because I know I think butcher in Alaska was one that was mentioned, and masseuse in Poland. So give us why do you seek out these? It seems like you seek out these unusual experiences, and is that all part of your process?
Well, some of these jobs that I've had, I really had to take because I needed money. I mean, sure. I'm not a trust fund kid, so I don't know. I suppose I have a little bit of more of an adventurous spirit than I realize, but I like to move around a lot. I like to to travel, and I've always felt that it sort of feeds my fiction to put myself in the position of sort of living other lives, for a little while, to sort of see, the perspectives of how people live outside of my regular sort of quotidian existence. And so, I mean, I guess I've never really thought of it as something that I've actively tried to cultivate, if that makes sense. I guess I don't intentionally kind of seek out the strange experience or the weird experience, but, they sort of come to me. I mean, I went to Alaska to actually work on one of those boats, one of the halibut boats, because you can make a lot of money doing that. And I needed money, over the summer before I actually came to England. And I lived in Manchester for a year. But when I got to Alaska, they told me that halibut season had just ended. I can't believe I'm even saying this sentence. That halibut season had just ended, and black cod season didn't start for another month. So I had to just find a job.
Right.
I was in Sitka, Alaska, and so I ended up working in this at this convenience store that had a meat counter. And so my job was to butcher meat, but I also rented videos. I had to clean the place. And there's nothing more humbling than hearing someone say over the intercom, Jessica, there's an yogurt cleanup on aisle 4,
Yeah.
and you've got a name tag that says just, your name
I've been
on
there,
it.
yeah. I worked in retail when I was younger. I've been there, I know.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, so, yeah, I mean, I would just say that somehow, these experiences have just sort of accidentally come to me. I actually, I gave massages in Poland because I went to Poland to teach English as a second language. And I was working at a summer camp in a tiny little village called Ritro on the Ukraine border. And when I got there, I'm an American. I wouldn't expect a huge amount of money, but they really didn't have as much to pay me as they said. So that's fine. So I ended up meeting this Polish man named Janusz, and he wore these great Bart Simpson T-shirts. And he was a professional masseuse, and he taught me how to give massages. And so I started giving massages, and people would pay me to massage them. It was very, and actually, I have to say, when I was in St. Petersburg, Russia, and my wallet was stolen, and I ended up having to spend the night in the St. Petersburg police station. This was at a writers' conference in St. Petersburg a while ago. This ended up being a useful skill. I gave massages in Russia as well, which got me home.
It's a great way. You massaged your way home. That's brilliant.
I don't know why somehow I cajoled people into paying me to, rub their shoulders, but that's all right.
That's great. So how do you think a lot of these kind of experiences sort of feed into your work, or do you think it's just almost by osmosis? It's just, it just comes out in the writing because of how you write anyway?
Well, gosh, that's an interesting question. I mean, I'm not an essayist. I'm not particularly interested in writing nonfiction, and people are constantly telling me that I should be, writing essays about these stories. But to me, as a fiction writer, I'm living my life, and sure. I'm just sort of, I'm taking in, whatever observations and sights and sounds and dialogues and whatever it is that I'm hearing in that moment. And they all become a part of who I am, which then becomes a part of what I write in fiction. And to me, weirdly, the moment that I try and, write down in nonfiction, an anecdote of something that happened in the past, to me, it just feels emotionally like it greatly reduces the experience. And suddenly I'm no longer interested in drawing from that experience into the fiction. And so I would say that what lasts for me, really as a writer, just living in the world, is this great aggregate, this collective amalgam of emotions, of observations, which prove themselves useful in the most surprising times as you're writing. You just are sort of paying attention to how your character feels, and then you remember or recall the precise moment when you felt that way, right? And so that's the act of translation in fiction. And I'm never going to get tired of that. To me, that's just infinitely and endlessly interesting.
Absolutely. I forget, it's a famous quote, and the name of the person that said it escapes me, but the idea that you very rarely do you remember a passage or a sentence or a specific page of a book, but you remember the way that it made you feel in any given moment. And I guess it comes down to that. It's the emotions that you take in from it rather than the specifics of it.
Well, and that's really where the truth in fiction lies too, Wayne, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, there's only so much I can do to persuade the reader of the truth of the characters and the worlds that I'm writing. Coleridge's notion of the suspension of disbelief can take you only so far, right?
Yeah.
But the real persuasion comes through how your character feels, what you recognize as a reader to be utterly true. And so suddenly the fiction becomes about you, the reader. That's the magic, right? It becomes about the reader's subconscious, the reader's history. And that's where I think, fiction does this beautiful, amazing work of uniting us. And, it can be done in really surprising ways, too. I mean, I personally struggle as a reader to feel emotionally connected to work that doesn't have, any kind of a wink to it, Wayne,
Sure, yeah.
I really prefer writers who have like a slight, at least a little bit of a sense of humor, because otherwise I feel like they're just
a little bit too earnest and a little bit too worthy sort of thing.
That's exactly it. You just sort of feel as though the writer is electing to ignore this whole other side of their consciousness. Now, maybe they're not a funny person to begin with.
Yeah,
maybe they never told a joke in their life. I don't know. But I would imagine that their character, potentially would. Like, there are moments of lightness and humor, even in the most tragic circumstances. And so I think writers that willfully walk away from humor are doing themselves a great disservice.
Yeah, and I don't think it's realistic. I think real life is full of that stuff. I mean, even in the darkest moments, there's usually some glimmer of light, or even if it is gallows humor or whatever.
That's right.
It's very rarely is it just completely and utterly black.
That's right. That's right.
Only for a beat or whatever. So what would you say? I mean, if you use Enter the Aardvark as an example, what was the hardest part of writing the book, would you say, and how did you overcome that?
The hardest part of writing the book, gosh, that's a that's a tough question.
Or should I say, or maybe think of it another way. What was the part that maybe in general when you write your books, what's the least enjoyable part for you?
That's sort of a tough question to answer, because I think for me as a writer, the entire process is so intricately sort of connected. I mean, I am both at my happiest and my most miserable when I'm writing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's this constant sort of interplay between ecstasy and misery. Misery because you know that you have to get this work done. I mean, it's just, you have to stay in your chair and you have to be there. And I would say an extrovert. I'm someone who enjoys being out in the world and going to parties and seeing my friends and my family. But, when you're a writer, you have to stay in. You have to, exercise the solipsistic existence in order to get the work done. So that's the piece of it that I struggle with the most. But by and large, I mean, the writing, as you said earlier, I mean, to me, this process of discovery is the most exciting and the most interesting. When I'm writing and drafting, like a first draft, I have a word count for myself. So I'll have to hit 1,000 words a day to get the first draft down. And so there's something both incredibly difficult but also incredibly fun about those early days of writing the novel, where you are just getting up in the morning, you're sitting down, and you've got to get to those 1,000 words. And sometimes it happens very quickly, and other times, it can take 8 to 10 hours to get that work done. So it varies greatly. It's sort of hard to isolate a single moment.
And do you find that with regards like your 1,000 words thing, is it a case of once you've gone past your 1,000 words, are you kind of quite disciplined and go, okay, well, I've done my 1,000 words for today, and I'll take the foot off the gas for a while and I'll come back to it tomorrow? Or if you're on a roll and you're just going, do you sometimes find that you've written, twice as many as words of that. As
oh
whatever.
yeah,
yeah.
And those days are great because then you know you have a day off the next day.
Well, that's what I was going to. That's what I was going to ask you. So, because I was very much thinking,
the day off. Yeah, exactly.
I was thinking the same thing. Do you average it out, or do you go, well, no, I'll just take that as a bonus? Yeah, you average it out.
I'm a huge cheater. So I have to. If I hit 2,000, then that's a real bonus. That's a joy. Yeah.
You've earned yourself a day off. Well, that's good. That's your little reward. And
right.
And do you enjoy, what about editing? Do you tend to are you kind of just, because you're a discovery writer, is it a case of just get the words down, don't stop to worry about it too much, find out where the story takes you, and then worry about it afterwards? Or do you tend to find yourself going back and editing as you go?
I always have to be happy with what I've written before I can move forward. And so some days of the writing the 1,000 words, it means going back and realizing that the scene I've just written is not adequate, mm-hmm. and I have to redo it. And those are my 1,000 words, or whatever it is, Mm-hmm. But by and large, I actually quite love revision. I mean, I believe deeply in the root definition of that word, which is to see again. Mm-hmm. To me, that really is what writing is all about. I mean, getting the first draft down is typing. And when I say I'm not happy with it, it's hard to move forward, without feeling good about what I've done. I mean, I'm sort of reimagining just the general arc of the story at that point. I'm sort of just, asking myself, would the character really go there or really do this? And if the answer is no, I redo it. But that's not the kind of revision that I'm talking about. Like once you have the draft down, mm-hmm. You really have to sit down and say, right, what is this? What have I written? Mm-hmm. And what is the question, the main thing this book is trying to ask, and how do all of these scenes and these narratives, I mean, how does it all kind of connect with itself? And, in that moment, you'll often find, these ancillary scenes or even potentially ancillary characters that really become slawed off. I mean, they just don't belong in the final draft for mm-hmm. whatever reason. And so you have to be, I think, very forgiving with yourself as a novelist, because there are going to be endless pages that never make the final cut, and you have to really, I think, enjoy the process of removal as much as addition, and recognize that it's actually its own kind of art form to know, what belongs, and to be honest with yourself about it, because that's what your reader needs too. I mean, in order to make a work of fiction cohere, the reader can't have any sense that something's in there that doesn't quite fit or doesn't belong. So I guess, that's a little bit of a rambling way of answering your question, but
No, it's not. It's interesting. I understand what you're saying. Yeah, you actually take pleasure from, you're honing it basically, and you're more than happy to do that. If something doesn't feel right, then get rid of it. I mean, that's kind of what I was talking about with the way that you write, because as you say, you're kind of a discovery writer. I mean, I'm similar myself. I don't really like a rigid plan or like to do lots of plotting, but I think the sort of not the downside, but the kind of flip side of that is that you can end up going down a cul-de-sac, and you can find yourself going to a bit of a dead end, or as you say, you've got a character in there that now doesn't need to be in there, sure. or sure. certain things. And when you first start doing that, it can be, as you say, I think that's the important part that you said about that, is not being too hard on yourself, because when you first start doing that, I think it's very, very tempting to say, oh, for God's sake, why did I put that in there? Or why did I think that was a good idea? Or why did I go there? That's a complete waste of time. That's, several days' work or whatever it is, or thousands of words or whatever it is, and it's a waste of time. But it's all part of the process, isn't it? So that's right. What you're saying.
It's not a waste of time. I mean, because it's getting you to the novel that you're really writing. And, I think the writers who have this concrete plan are constantly disappointed in the result.
Yeah.
Because the novel that you can write is never the novel that you think it is, that you think you can write. And so, you have to open yourself up to the surprise of story. Your characters really, if they're working, they have their own ambitions, and your job is sort of journalistic in that way. You have to get very close to them and figure it out, who they really are and what they really want, because the bottom line is they're not you. And so if you don't allow your characters to surprise you, then the fiction, it seems to me, is just delivering information about a person rather than offering a reader access to that person's interiority and their psyche, which makes the fiction actually about the reader. That's what we were talking about earlier.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So where did all this writing malarkey come from with you? What's your earliest memory of writing? When did you realize that you might want to write books?
Wow. Well, I don't know about writing books, but I've always been a reader. I just have loved to read always. And I started writing, I suppose, my first story I wrote in college. And I remember distinctly, this was actually right before I went to the University of Manchester for a year, for my junior year abroad. I saw that at Manchester, you could take creative writing for college credit.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh my God, you can do that for credit.
Yeah.
And so, suddenly I started writing stories when I was in college, and I'd been writing poetry for a while, a few years before my junior year abroad. And so, I'd taken a number of poetry workshops. I worked with a wonderful poet at the college where I went, Bates College. And so I already was, sort of trained slightly, a little bit trained in ear and sound, and language. But story was suddenly this just wonderfully freeing, it was a new feeling. It was like, poems are such tight and insular little spaces, or at least they can feel that way. Mm-hmm. And there was something quite open about fiction that I just was immediately drawn to. And so I came to the University of Manchester in the late 90s and studied with Professor Michael Schmidt, who I think some folks know over in Britain. I was speaking with my editor about Michael Schmidt. Apparently he's pretty well known over there. And I worked with Richard Francis, another novelist in Britain. And I will say that in Britain, the writing workshop is a little bit of a different experience than it is in the United States.
Mm-hmm. In what way?
In the sense that I don't think the British care as much about your precious emotions in workshop,
right,
which is actually quite useful.
From a critique point of view, do you mean?
Sorry?
From a critique point of view, do you mean, in terms of giving you?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So you submit your story, your crappy short story for workshop, and no one's going to have any patience with it. I mean, if nothing's working, then nothing's working.
Yeah.
But it was a big eye opener for me. I mean, I have to say, as an American, we care a great deal about people's emotions over here, and so It was just, suddenly there was no hand holding and but I really admired this moment. It's just the knives came out, and frankly, it was exactly what I needed. Wayne, I mean, I really, I think I developed more as a writer in that 1 year in England, than I did with, any other writing workshop I had here in the States. But it was many years, and it was like at least 5 or 6 years after that until I went to my MFA in fiction. And by the time I went to my MFA, I had a pretty strong sense of voice and my own interests in story. So I really viewed the masters in fiction as time to write. And I worked with some brilliant writers, don't get me wrong, and they definitely they gave me some very rock solid advice about writing fiction. But I would say that it's important to kind of arrive into story in a way that feels maybe slightly earned and individual, before you go to the major writing workshop, which is the MFA. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You get, at least for me, I got addicted to this very early on, and I can't quit it yet. It's this monkey on my back. So
it's a compulsion. Yeah. So what was your path to publication with your first book, The Convalescent?
Oh my goodness. How nice of you to ask. Let's see. So McSweeney's is the press out in San Francisco. And I actually saw, you're going to like this, Wayne. I saw an advertisement for a writing prize called the Amanda Davis Highwire Fiction Award.
Yeah.
And they were asking for manuscripts from a woman writing fiction who was under the age of 32 and who had some unusual jobs.
Perfect. It's like the advert was written for you, wasn't it?
Really, I mean, I saw the advertisement and thought, is this real? Is this happening? And so, I had a new short story that was pretty finished. It was ready to go about a female matador. And I also had the opening 10,000 words to The Convalescent, and I sent it to McSweeney's. And miraculously, 4 months later, Venda Levita called me and told me that I'd won the prize. And so I knew that McSweeney's was going to be interested in reading the novel, and sure enough, they were. And that's how my first book was published. And then I also wrote a graphic novel, Chopsticks, with the creative director at Farrar, Straus and Giroux in New York, Rodrigo Corral, who was terrific. And that came out in 2012. And then, it's been a little bit of time, since Chopsticks and Enter the Aardvark. I wrote a number of sort of novellas and other fictions that didn't make the final cut for the next book, but now here we are. It's a thin, little, mean, funny book, Wayne, about U.S. politics and about taxidermy and aardvarks, and it's what the last 5 years have led me to. So
absolutely, yeah. Well, as we sort of move towards wrapping things up, so what would you say has been the most helpful piece of creative or inspirational advice you've been given during your life or your career?
The most helpful piece of advice that I've been given. Gosh. I love your questions. You're really getting to the bones here, like bare bones questions.
Sometimes it might feel like you're in analysis, but hopefully not.
I will just say, I worked with the wonderful writer Alan Schuss when I was in my MFA program, and Alan passed away, sadly, a few years ago, sort of a tragic car accident, but he was a brilliant writer and a wonderful teacher. And he would always every time I saw him, he only had one question for me, which was, how's the writing? And I think about that. I return to it often because it really isn't a piece of advice per se, but it's just a reminder that it's the thing that matters most, right, amongst other writers, is how's the writing going? And no one really who isn't a writer can fully appreciate the importance of that question. When we're constantly being asked to care about all of the other, tragedies and chaoses in our world. I mean, certainly in this moment,
sure, yeah.
Our attentions are being diverted, but I just keep returning to the most important thing, which is how's the writing. And so I'm not sure that I'm answering the question.
No, I think that is a great point, and you're right. Actually, I know with myself and my writer friends, you're right. That is the one question that always comes up, and it's always the most important one for people. How's the writing? No, I think you're right, and sometimes you forget. It's like for whatever real life gets in the way, and you have to go away from writing for a period of time, or
right. Even
if it's only for days or weeks or a couple of months at a time or whatever it is. And sometimes you need somebody to ask that question, and you sort of say, how is the writing? Well, it's not at the minute, and let's get back to it.
My friend Deborah Unferth, who actually has her new novel is also out in the UK called Barn 8. It's terrific. She actually has a great little speech about this, which is everyone wants your failure, which is to say your parents actually want your failure as a writer because they're asking you to come to dinner. Your friends, every time they ask you to come out to a party, they want you to fail. Your dog wants you to fail at writing because they need to be taken out. It's this marvelous line of like everyone who wants you to fail at this. But yeah, I agree completely. I mean, I think it is in the end the most important question. Yeah. And
I think for people that don't write, I suppose it's the same for anybody. I think it's probably the same for painters or anything else. But
that's right.
If you don't write, it does seem. They seem, I mean, even I know my wife looks at me sometimes when I go in and I look miserable, and she says, what's the matter? And I'm like, I just can't sort this thing out, this problem that I've got with this bit of the story, or how this thing ends, or I can't find the right end line, or whatever it happens to be. And she kind of, it's not that she's unsympathetic, but I do see a look in her eyes like, why are you so bothered about that? Why are you so upset about it, or whatever? Why is it on your mind so much? And I think, to write or to paint or whatever it is, whatever artistic endeavor that you do really need to immerse yourself into it and throw yourself into it and care about it. I guess that's the main thing, really.
Yeah, and the bottom line, Wayne, is that the relationship is really between you and the work. I mean, no one else can really make it better for you or easier for you. No one is going to understand, your failures and victories. It's just between you and what you write. And, there's weirdly some kind of strange consolation knowing that too, that, part of the marvel about this work is that it's not public, that, you're not constantly on stage, right? Failing on stage.
Yeah.
You have a lot of private time to get it right, which is why I suppose I care so deeply about getting it right. There's no reason not to get it right. But that certainly also means it's difficult, quiet, private work that only you fundamentally can figure out. I don't belong to any writing groups or anything anymore. I really don't share my work until I feel like it's ready to be shared. I've had people ask me. I don't know if you are you in a writing group? Or?
I have been. I'm not right now, but I have been. I've been in a critique group, and like you, when I first joined that critique group, it was probably the single biggest improvement in my writing when I went there. Yeah. It was a big shock the first time. The first sort of few minutes of getting that type of feedback, but it was also like thrilling because it was like, hang on a minute, this is giving me actual things I can go away now and take that little piece of advice and immediately improve my work. I found it like thrilling, really.
Well, and it's thrilling when those readers sort of report back to you everything that deep down is true about the work. You're just not ready to face it.
You're right. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
So, they're just there. They're telling you what you know, and so you feel affirmed by that, and then you go back and you do the work. Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely. Okay, well, just before we go, can you give us a sense of what's up next? I know obviously Enter the Aardvark is only just about to come out, but can you give us a sense of what you're working on now? Or
yeah, well, it's a novel. I don't really know what's going to happen with it. I don't usually talk about the work, that I'm writing, but I will just say that it might or might not have something to do with the death of George Washington. I'm not sure.
Exciting.
Yeah.
And where can people find out more about you and your work online? Are you on any social media or anything like that?
Yeah, I actually am. I'm on Instagram under Enter the Aardvark. You can find me there.
Perfect. Okay, well, it's been absolutely brilliant to talk to you. Good luck with the book when it comes out.
Thank you so much.
It's been really good chatting to you. Hopefully you can come back on again when you finish your next Dead President's book.
Yes.
You probably come on.
It'll be a while.
Yeah,
it'll be a while.
It'll probably be like about a giraffe or a tortoise or something completely different. You're just starting out, but you're at the beginning of your discovery journey, so it'll be interesting to see where it leads.
Oh, thanks so much, Wayne.
Okay, thanks again to Jessica Anthony, and I'll put a link to her Instagram and book in the show notes over at joinedupwriting.co.uk. That's it for this week, but don't forget you can find the entire back catalogue of interviews on the website and in all the usual places with your podcast providers. Make sure you subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, or wherever else you get your podcasts to have the podcast downloaded automatically every week. It's also on YouTube, and you can leave us comments there as well. Also, remember to leave us a nice rating and review on Apple Podcast, as it really does help others to find the show. Or even, just tell somebody or just share it on social media, whatever. Just let people know about the show and spread the love, basically. Next episode is a chat with Laura Zigman about her new novel, Separation Anxiety. Until then, thanks for listening. I'm Wayne Kelly. Happy writing and reading. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.